Hi, I'm Lily. Well, technically, my name's Lillian, but no one calls me that unless I'm in trouble. I spent 6 years as a camp counselor, and it was one of the best times of my life, or at least it used to be. I loved the freedom of being outdoors, the camaraderie with the other counselors, and the joy of teaching kids about the beauty of nature. It felt like I belonged there, under the canopy of trees, surrounded by laughter and the smell of campfires. But then there was that one summer, the summer that changed everything. At our camp, things ran like clockwork. The kids would stay for a week of adventures, then head home, and we'd have a few days to ourselves before the next group arrived. From May to August, we lived by this schedule, and it worked beautifully until the last week of camp that year. It started like any other. We counselors were buzzing with excitement because we'd planned something special for the kids, a 3-night camping trip deep into the woods. We'd been hyping it up for weeks, ghost stories by the fire, roasted marshmallows, s'mores, and the thrill of sleeping under the stars. It was going to be the perfect send-off. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. The kids began arriving, dragging their overstuffed duffel bags and chattering away as they claimed their bunks. The cabin was filled with the usual chaos, laughing, shouting, and the occasional complaint about someone taking the best bed. Then I saw him. He stood near the doorway, a small boy with messy dark hair and an oversized jacket that looked like it belonged to someone else. While the other campers were busy unpacking and settling in, he just stood there, motionless, clutching a backpack that appeared nearly empty. His eyes darted around the room, but he never said a word. "Hey there," I said, walking over with my friendliest smile. "I'm Lily, one of the counselors." "What's your name?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me with those dark, empty eyes. For a moment, I thought he might not have heard me. But then he turned away, his gaze fixed somewhere I couldn't see. It was unsettling, but I told myself he was just shy. Lots of kids are nervous their first day, right? I figured he'd warm up eventually. When it was time for our first activity, a good old-fashioned game of kickball, I made sure to keep an eye on him. The kids were split into teams, and soon enough, the field was alive with laughter and playful shouting. The sound of the ball smacking against sneakers and the rustling of the wind through the trees created that perfect camp atmosphere I loved. But Ryan, as I later learned his name was, didn't join in. He didn't even try. Instead, he stood at the edge of the field, his small figure silhouetted against the trees. His back was turned to us, and he was staring into the woods like he was searching for something, or waiting for it. "Hey, Lily," Jason, another counselor, said as he walked over to me. "What's up with that kid?" "That's Ryan," I replied, keeping my voice low so the other kids wouldn't overhear. "I think he's just shy. Maybe a little introverted." Jason raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "All right. Let me know if you need help with him." The game went on, but Ryan stayed exactly where he was, unmoving. Something about the way he stood there made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It wasn't like he was just bored or nervous. It was like he didn't belong. When lunchtime rolled around, I made sure to keep a close eye on him. The cafeteria was loud and chaotic, as always, with kids clamoring for food and trading jokes across the long wooden tables. I brought over the trays of food and tried to get everyone settled, but my attention kept drifting to Ryan. He didn't sit with the other kids. Instead, he chose the far end of the table, where no one else dared to sit. When I set his tray in front of him, he barely looked at it. He didn't touch his food, not even the warm mac and cheese that most kids would have devoured in seconds. "Not hungry?" I asked softly, crouching beside him. He didn't respond. The other campers barely seemed to notice him, too caught up in their own excitement and chatter. But I couldn't shake the strange, heavy feeling in my chest. Later that afternoon, we had a nature scavenger hunt planned, but I couldn't focus on it. Ryan's distant gaze and eerie stillness were stuck in my head. Something about him was off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I told myself I was overthinking it. Kids like Ryan just needed time, right? But deep down, I knew this week was going to be different. I just didn't realize how different. Ryan, however, didn't touch his food. He just sat there, staring blankly at his plate like it wasn't even there. "Aren't you hungry?" I asked, crouching down beside him. He looked up at me briefly, his dark eyes locking with mine for just a second before he turned away again without a word. "You should eat before our next activity," I tried again, keeping my tone light and cheerful. "It's going to take a lot of energy." "We're going canoeing," I added, throwing in a big smile, hoping to excite him. For a split second, his expression changed. His eyes widened, not with excitement, but with something closer to fear. Then he lowered his gaze to the floor and stayed that way until everyone else had finished eating. When we got to the river, the scene was picture perfect. The sunlight sparkled off the water, and the trees lining the shore swayed gently in the breeze. Mark, one of the other counselors, was already there, setting up. He'd lined up the canoes along the shore and laid out bright orange life vests for all the kids. Mark and I worked quickly, distributing the vests, tightening the straps for the smaller kids, and helping them into the canoes one by one. It was always my favorite activity. The laughter, the splashing, and the simple joy of being on the water, it never got old. But when it was Ryan's turn, everything changed. The quiet, shy boy we'd seen all day suddenly erupted into a storm of panic. He screamed, kicked, and clung to the shore, begging us not to make him get into the canoe. His voice cracked with desperation, and his words came out in frantic bursts. "Please. Don't make me go. I can't do it. I'm scared." Mark knelt beside him, trying to calm him down. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. We've got a lifeguard right here, and you'll be wearing a life vest. Nothing's going to happen. I promise." But Ryan wasn't listening. He was shaking so hard that it looked like his knees might give out beneath him. "Mark, stop," I said firmly, placing a hand on his arm. "If he's this scared, we're not forcing him. It's not worth it." Mark hesitated but eventually nodded. "All right," he said, standing and giving me a small shrug. As the rest of the group paddled out onto the river, I stayed behind with Ryan. We sat together on the wooden bench near the shore. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of paddles cutting through the water. After a while, Ryan finally spoke. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "For what?" I asked, turning to look at him. "For saving me," he said, his eyes staring straight ahead at the shimmering water. His words sent a chill down my spine. I ruffled his hair playfully, trying to brush off the strange feeling. "No problem, kiddo," I said. But my hand froze as I touched his hair, it felt damp. But that was impossible. He hadn't even gone near the water. The rest of the campers returned soon after, chattering excitedly about their time on the river. I shook off the strange moment and helped herd everyone back to the cabin. Later that night, when I thought everyone was asleep, I stayed up to organize some paperwork. I was just about to head to bed when I caught movement in the mirror in front of me. I turned, startled, to find Ryan standing there, his small frame illuminated by the faint moonlight streaming through the window. "Ryan. You scared me," I said with a nervous laugh. "What are you doing up? You should be in bed." "I can't sleep," he mumbled. His voice was low and muffled, almost like he was speaking through water. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked, my concern growing. "I want to go home," he said, his eyes dropping to the floor. I knelt down in front of him. "Hey, it's just your nerves. I know the first night at camp can be tough, but I promise it gets better. Try to get some rest, and by morning you'll feel a lot better. Okay?" He didn't respond. He just turned and walked back into the darkened room where the other campers were fast asleep. But when morning came, Ryan wasn't there. We called roll, and his absence was glaring. The kids shrugged when I asked if they'd seen him. Mark and I searched every corner of the cabin, under the bunks, behind the storage bins, but Ryan was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as I sprinted to the main office. I burst through the door, out of breath, and found Mr. Turner, the camp director, at his desk. "Mr. Turner, we have a missing camper," I exclaimed, my voice trembling. He immediately straightened in his chair. "Who is it?" he asked, his tone calm but serious. "Ryan. Ryan Matthews," I said quickly. Mr. Turner began typing on his computer, pulling up the camper database. But then his expression hardened. He looked at me with narrowed eyes. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked sharply. "What? No. Why would I joke about something like this?" I said, confused and frustrated. "Because there's no record of a Ryan Matthews ever being registered for this camp," he said, his voice rising. "And I don't find that funny. I don't have any camper scheduled under the name Ryan Matthews," Mr. Turner said, his tone clipped and skeptical. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean he's not scheduled? He was in my group all day. Red hair, green eyes, pale skin, freckles, he was here. I spoke to him. I touched his arm," I insisted, my voice shaking. Mr. Turner's expression darkened, but he nodded slowly. "We'll call the authorities and report it," he said, his calm demeanor doing little to soothe the panic clawing at my chest. As he dialed, Mark and I scrambled to call the parents of other campers, letting them know about the situation. Most came storming in to retrieve their kids, shouting accusations about negligence and threatening lawsuits. A few stayed to help with the search, their flashlights slicing through the encroaching darkness like fragile beacons. The authorities arrived as the last glimmers of daylight faded, plunging the camp into an oppressive, moonlit silence. The lead officer approached me with a notepad in hand. "Can you give me a description of the missing boy?" "His name is Ryan Matthews," I said, my throat tight. "He's small, about 8 years old. Red hair, green eyes, pale skin with freckles. He was wearing a blue shirt and khaki shorts." The officer frowned as he jotted this down. He left, muttering something into his radio, and returned minutes later, his face grim. He leaned in close to Mr. Turner, whispering urgently. Turner's face twisted into a mask of disbelief and fear. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice low and deliberate, "are you absolutely sure about this boy? About what he looks like, what he said, everything?" "Yes, of course I'm sure," I replied, frustration bubbling in my chest. "Why does everyone keep questioning me? He was real." The officer hesitated before speaking. "Ryan Matthews was an 8-year-old boy who drowned in that river 4 years ago." The words knocked the breath out of me. The world around me seemed to shift, everything tilting off balance. No, I whispered, shaking my head. That's not possible. He was here today. I saw him. I talked to him. The officer's frown deepened. The details you've given match exactly. The clothes, the hair, it's all the same. But Ryan's been gone for years. A memory surged to the surface, a news segment about a boy who'd gone missing during a camp canoeing trip, his small face on every screen. My stomach churned as I realized why Ryan's face had felt so familiar. He touched my arm, I said, almost to myself. Ghosts don't do that, do they? Mark stepped in, his face pale. I saw him too. He was there, he was real. This isn't just her imagination. The officer scribbled down our statements, his expression unreadable, and returned to his search team. Back in the office, Mr. Turner was fuming. I cannot believe you two have the audacity to concoct such an outrageous story, he spat. This isn't just unprofessional, it's sick. We're not lying. I shouted, my voice cracking. Ryan was here. We both saw him. Turner's rage only grew. The argument spiraled until I stormed out, tears stinging my eyes. That night, as I packed my belongings, the cabin felt suffocatingly quiet. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, set my nerves on edge. The oppressive silence was worse than any noise. I switched off the lights and stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin. The camp was cloaked in shadow, the moon casting a cold, silver glow. I made my way toward the parking lot, desperate to leave this nightmare behind. Then I saw him. Ryan stood at the edge of the woods, bathed in pale moonlight. His red hair seemed to glow, and his green eyes locked onto mine with an unsettling intensity. Ryan? I whispered, frozen in place. He smiled, a slow, eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you, he said softly, his voice carrying across the still night. Before I could respond, he stepped backward into the shadows of the trees. But as he vanished, something else emerged, the dark, hulking figure with glowing eyes. It stood just beyond the tree line, its form twisted and unnatural, as if the woods themselves had come alive. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, and the creature began to move toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. My flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam swinging wildly. When I scrambled to grab it, the figure was gone. But Ryan wasn't. He was standing right in front of me now, his smile wider, his eyes darker. You should have stayed away from the river, he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The last thing I saw before everything went black was his outstretched hand, cold and wet, pulling me down into darkness.